Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to meet you here in our lovely lecture on in the series of Understanding Europe's East. Bună seara, doamnelor și domnilor, bine ați venit în Trinity College Dublin. Good evening, Your Excellency, the Romanian Ambassador to Ireland, Laurențiu Mihai Ștefan. My name is Anna. On behalf of the Eastern European Society, I will open today's lecture. Just a couple of words about the society. For those who don't know, we just opened a few years ago with one main goal of helping promote the rich cultural heritage of our countries. So I'm more than delighted to present to you this series, which is something that have not been seen before. Today we're co-presenting with another college society, which is DU History Society. So many thanks to them as well. And before I start, just a few housekeeping things. In the unlikely event that there will be in an emergency, there are two exits from which you come in and from which you could exit. Also, if I may request you to mute your phones, and all of the questions we will have more than enough time at the end. Okay. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Beatrice Scutaru, I would like to ask Connor Daly of the Department of Russian and Slavonic Studies to just say a few words about our evening.
Thank you very much, Anna. Bună seara și bun venit tuturor, and welcome to Lecture 4 in our series. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the genesis of the series. Notice that the series title we've chosen is not Understanding Eastern Europe, but Understanding Europe's East. And there's a point to that, because when we talk about countries like Bulgaria, Kosovo, Estonia, or this evening's guest, Romania, we're very careful to give them agency. We need to give them agency, not to treat them as part of that mass of countries traditionally labelled Eastern Europe, with all the baggage, the Cold War baggage about Europe's other, the not us connotations that has. So our subject countries are part of us. They're in Europe, they are Europe, they're just on the other side of Europe. The difference being that they have Russia as a near neighbour, and which gives questions of agency and identity a particular urgency. Now, last week, Heiko Pebo of the University of Tartu explained to us how in his country, Estonian citizens have different expectations of what it means to be Estonian based on their ethnic background. He told us about, for Estonian speakers, it's about the restoration of agency around the Estonian language and traditions, whereas for Russian citizens of Estonia, they're nostalgic for a more Soviet-type Brotherhood of Nations concept of identity. But what the two groups have in common is that there's overlap in that both aspire to democracy, and both are disappointed in their political elites. So not a stereotypical understanding of that part of our continent. And I think tonight we can also expect to see some stereotypes broken. We know of Romania's deep connections to Western European traditions. The clue is in the name, Romania. And I look forward to hearing some surprising things from Beatrice Scutaru this evening. Just to add that this event is part supported by Trinity College's Faculty Arts Fund. And back to you, Anna, to introduce our speaker.
Now, finally, to just introduce Dr. Beatrice Scutaru is a historian of modern and contemporary Europe. Beatrice specializes in transnational history with a focus on migration, childhood, and the Cold War. Beatrice obtained a PhD in contemporary history at the University of Angers in France, and before joining Dublin City University, she was a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Padua in Italy, and an assistant professor at Trinity College Dublin, my youth university. And most importantly, she our dear guest today, so I will welcome you to the microphone. Perfect.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for braving the terrible weather outside and being here this evening to hear me try to break stereotypes. I'm going to do my best. So I am a historian. I have been working on Romania and especially migration and transnational relations of Romania since post-1945. For a long period now, and this talk draws on my most recent interests in types of humanitarian aid and care provided by Romania to refugees in the aftermath of the Second World War. Now, I started working on this topic and being interested in this topic as a result of the questions that kind of emerged in my, as a result of my previous research. And so this quote I found quite funny when I was looking at Romanian immigration. So the last one who leaves should turn off the light, which was a joke that was often used during communism, but it also reflects kind of an attitude and a custom of emigration from Romania. So Romania is a country from which people have emigrated during the Cold War, before in the interwar period, and to find better opportunities, better work and living conditions abroad. And this is a topic on which I've been conducting research. But this is not the only reality of Romania. Now, Romania is also known as a country, just like the rest of the countries in the region, country that receives humanitarian aid and is in need of humanitarian aid and has received humanitarian aid across the decades. This is an image from the Opération Village Roumain, Romanian Villages Operation, which was launched in the 80s and continued in the 90s. And it's still ongoing, and it's kind of town twinning cooperation, but mainly it's based on humanitarian aid. And of course, a lot of the aid provided to Romania was especially in relation to child institutionalization. And I didn't want to use any of the images that we can find online. I just wanted to use an image of the of an institution. A reality which was discovered immediately after the December Revolution, and which brought about a lot of physical, like material aid, but also an influx of population who tried to aid Romanian children by adopting them, and this led to a surge in international adoption. Some regulated, a lot of it not regulated. International adoption, which is now banned in Romania. So on all of these topics, I've conducted research, and then I started to wonder, what about the other way around? Is this just, receiving aid, or just people leaving? And there's another reality, and this is also a reflection of how research has changed in the last few decades. And while before the focus was mainly on leaving and the region as a receiver of aid, now there's a lot of research that focuses on reception and the actions and the long tradition of providing aid by countries in the region. So just to illustrate, as I was saying, on the left you have a volume that kind of illustrates this focus on transnational aid and actions by countries in East Central Europe. And then next to it is the poster of a workshop to which I attended. This is in Romanian because I didn't have time to translate it, but it kind of illustrates the different ways Romanians provided different types of aid internationally. So we have scholarship programs for students from newly independent countries or from countries from Latin America to come and study in Romania. We have medical teams of doctors and nurses who would go to work abroad. There's a variety of examples. One of them is Libya. Then relations with kind of investments and collaborations with India, but a lot of countries on the African continent. So these are some of just to kind of have a geographical idea of the spread of the different types of actions. Now, in terms of forms of humanitarian aid provided by Romania, so these are forms of humanitarian aid that are similar to those of other countries in the region. And Romania was also involved in kind of supporting a variety of conflicts. Between North and South Korea, the Vietnam War, and other conflicts. And some of the measures were through the collection of goods. goods that, after being collected, they were sent by train or with medical teams who would go abroad. Medical teams, for example, who went to North Korea. And this, we see kind of the parallel of all the goods and the cardboard boxes that Romania, we know, received, and then this action was taking place also the other way around. A great variety of fundraising campaigns with money that was then transferred, or then so people would send money to a bank account. Or events would be organized, and the money that would be collected would then be used for the benefits to help directly the populations that were targeted. Volunteer work is something that's really important, and I was a bit surprised by how important this is, and I would like to kind of look into this more, the role of volunteer work in providing aid and support both abroad and nationally. And what I'm going to focus on today, and if I speak more than 40 minutes from the beginning, just let me know and I will stop. Reception, so aid provided on the territory, especially the reception of children. Now, for practical reasons, because it's easier to find information about large groups than kind of separate individuals, I've focused especially on three main groups, especially on the first two. So on your left, you have Greek children. So there are three main groups of children that were received in Romania during, after 1945. Greek and Macedonian children that were received starting in 1948, 1949, and some lived their whole life in Romania. Then we have children from North Korea who arrived in Romania in the 50s, and then towards the mid and end of the 50s, they were all sent back. And then these were children who were mainly unaccompanied. They arrived alone, and they were housed in big institutions. So that's, we see the connection through the institutions I mentioned before, and how I'm interested, how did this kind of start, what kind of system was put in place now, and how did it evolve later on in the later years. And the topic on which I've done the least research is that of the Chilean refugees who were received in the 70s in Romania. And many of them actually immigrated towards by the end of the 70s and the 80s, and these children arrived with their families. So it's a lot more difficult to have information about the children, only the children themselves. Now, Romania is also, most information about Romania is about Ceausescu and the period after 1965. And I wanted to go a bit back in time and see what were the origins of some of the measures that were implemented after the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and what happened, at the beginning of this new state, the Popular Republic of Romania. So the first group of children arrives in 1948, the beginning of 1948, which are the first months of the Popular Republic of Romania. So after the end of the Second World War, communist regime is not immediately and directly implemented. It comes by in several steps. And in December 1947, the king is forced to abdicate, and then we have the Popular Republic of Romania, and the leader, Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej, who was the leader of Romania between 1948 and 1965, when Ceausescu took over. And some of the decisions that start to be taken in this period, then are continued later on by Ceausescu and kind of diversified. And one of these is kind of putting the basis of the child protection system and child institutionalization system. And this is just kind of the image of that was existed in the middle of the flag. So when you've seen images of the revolution with the flag without with the hole in the middle, it's because what the symbol, I don't know the English word for that, was kind of cut off from that. I know the Romanian word. Yes. So what I want to talk about is, and I hope to be able to do that, what happened briefly, with a focus especially on the Greek children, and then why is it important to kind of think about this, and what does it say about Romania? Why did Romania kind of get involved in these actions? So first, have the Greek Civil War, which led to huge mass displacement of the population, and Romania, just like other countries in East Central Europe, so these are maps of the conflicts, but also on this map on the right, you have a map of the different places where children were received. So about 20,000 children were displaced by the communists. In the beginning of 1948, the Communist Party of Greece decided to save children. It would be better to displace them across the border. Initially, they went to Bulgaria, Albania, and Yugoslavia, and then they were kind of distributed to other countries as the war was growing longer, and also as it was very difficult for countries in the aftermath of the Second World War to take care of kind of larger and larger numbers of children. So we have the conflicts, and so the Communist Party decided to displace children. This is not a new thing. This has been happening throughout the 20th century, and with large numbers of children. And in Greece, this is something that happened. The Communist Party did this, and Queen Frederica did the same thing, but on the other side. So one side wanted to save them from the fascists, and the other side wanted to save them from the communists. So children were taken and displaced in different types of institutions, some abroad, some within the Greek state. And this is still a topic of conflict, controversy in Greece. But, so what I'm looking at is Romania. So the Greek party decided in 1948 that it would be better for the safety of the children, but also so that their parents could be kind of involved in the conflict without kind of being worried about what might happen to their children in the conflict. And quite fast, as you can see, children started arriving in Romania. So first about 1,000 arrived, 1892 in Calibanești, and about 13 centers. So they were put in about 13 centers across the territory, and their numbers grow quite fast. So generally speaking, about 6,000 children, Greek and Macedonian children, arrived in Romania during this period. Some lived in Romania during this period. Some were sent to other countries. Others from other countries were sent to Romania. So there's a lot of circulation of children during this time. And in relation to North Korean children that I mentioned, it's about 2,000 at the highest number. We have 1,500, 2,000 children, a very organized kind of displacement of children. These displacements were not very well organized, so it was kind of a mess. How kind of they crossed all the borders, and some they crossed initially on foot. So their conditions, like physical, mental, medical, were really, really bad when they arrived in the different countries. So you get a vision of how they were spread across the territory. Actually, I remembered wrong about the numbers of Korean children, between 1,000 and 3,000. So I just chose the number in between. And what's really interesting about this is that some of the institutions that were used for Greek children, when these Greek children kind of age out or go to other institutions, start to be used for the North Korean children. So there's this kind of continuity of usage of space and of the institutions and the practices that continue. And there's also, while the children didn't have a lot of contact initially with the general population, there were kind of events organized for both children or holidays organized for them. together. So initially, as I was mentioning, it was kind of a mess. Romania was, just like all countries in the aftermath of the Second World War, in a very difficult economic situation. Also a new state that was trying to build its new kind of structures and institutions, seeing what can be used from the past, what can we bring new. So it's kind of this combination of new, something older, something new. And I hope I'll have time to go into that. And accepts to receive these children. Initially, it was believed to be a very small number of children for a short period of time while the war would be won. But in reality, this becomes a very long period of time because the war is lost and then the children stay on the territory. So children are received in and put in large buildings like this. This looks really nice, right? Imagine for children who had, many were born during the Second World War or before the Second World War, so their life had been conflict all the time, and then the Civil War. So arriving in a place where there was no actual conflict was beneficial, but the financial situation of the country was very difficult. So kind of access to food and goods was still difficult in the beginning. Now, these institutions were chosen for two reasons. One, because they're very big and they were able to house big numbers of children. You saw 900 arrived and then 1,000 or 1,500. Second, because following the example of the Soviet Union, Romania decided to democratize tourism. So these buildings that were mainly used by the cultural elite, bourgeoisie, during the interwar period, now were nationalized and were meant to be used by the workers for kind of, and be open to everyone, so everybody could have access to this form of leisure and free time. The issue was that many of them were mainly used during the summer. So when the children arrived, it was still very cold. So, and they didn't necessarily have the infrastructure to have all these children together. So mainly the rooms were for one or two individuals, and having several beds for several children at the same time was complicated. So when they arrived here, this is the first place where they arrived. They were put in the general school. They were they're given a medical checkup, and those who were in better condition were then sent to these institutions, and the other ones were sent to nearby hospitals because they needed different types of protection. Then an individual sheet was created for each of them, and they received a medallion. I don't have an image of the medallion, but I have this, initially of General Marcos, with an identifying number of their. And then when General Marcos was replaced, they received another. But so in their everyday life, Greece and what was happening in Greece in the war was very, very present. And initially, there was an attempt to kind of structure their everyday life here, but it didn't work really well because these children had been traumatized. Some had been separated. Some had been taken without actually knowing what was going on. So they didn't want to separate from their family. For example, if they had contagious disease, the idea was to separate them, but they didn't want to be separated. What if some of them would be taken and sent to another country, as had happened before? So it was kind of initially, the idea was to separate them by age, but in the end, the organizers accepted to allow them to stay by community, as they felt they would be more kind of safer. Also, during this period, the main concern was their physical health. So the idea was, once they feel better physically, then we can think of their kind of how to educate them or think of other aspects. The psychological aspect or the impact of the trauma of war was not really mentioned in any of the reports or as a concern, but the kind of prevention of illness was a really a huge concern. And throughout the period, the medical staff was sometimes higher in number than the staff, the other staff that worked in these institutions. Now, while the children stay longer, and then they realize that in reality the war was lost, and then children will stay here for longer periods of time. The idea is to organize life in a more structured way. And these are patterns that we see happening across Europe, and it's not typical of this country. So here I want to talk to you about Sinai. Sinai is somewhere in the center, and these are two institutions that received about 1,800 children. Some were toddlers, like really small children that were accompanied by mothers. Some were the real mothers, some were women from the community who were with them and taking care of them. And the other one, the other institution was with kind of older children. Generally, the children were between 3 and 14, because at 14 it was believed that they could fight. And then there was this attempt, and some children did go back to fight. So they came to institutions and presented, who wants to volunteer to go back, and some did volunteer and go back, but this was stopped quite fast, and because also these children were not really trained for war. But it was also another perception, with age and at what age people could be start working or be involved in in a conflict. So in Sinai was open until the mid-50s, and when all the children left, the children who left from here mainly went either to started working or went into the general education system. They continued working high school, some went to university. Very few, in terms of percentage across the region, very few actually went to university. But the life becomes a lot more regulated, and this is an attempt that initially starts kind of from the bottom up at each institutional level, and then becomes centralized. In Bucharest, we have a structure that is imposed. And initially, when I was looking at this, they were using a document from a childcare institution in the Soviet Union. But then when you look at the examples, well, I hope I'll have time to talk about that, the examples of the activities or the structure, we see that this actually is not something typical of the East, that these structures exist. For example, I looked at institutions in France, and then this kind of daily life, very structured and with physical activity outside, was very, very present. Education was very important initially in Romanian and in Greek and Macedonian, and the Macedonian children was frustrated because they had to learn Greek, but the Greek children didn't have to learn Macedonian, so they thought it was unfair. There was not a lot of material because everything happened so fast, so there was not textbooks, and so in that at European level, they had to translate textbooks in different languages and bring them to or make copies of textbooks and bring them to children. Then also kind of uniforms, and I really like this picture because as I was mentioning, volunteer work was very important. So these are uniforms that were made at these children's homes. So they would order fabric at central level. So they would say, we need this. So then the Red Cross was actually, I skipped that. The Red Cross was the one in charge of the refugees. The Red Cross was reorganized in the aftermath of the Second World War, and was in charge of the refugees from Poland, Yugoslavia. No, they're not the only ones. And so the main communication would be with the Red Cross, and then the Red Cross would then communicate with different ministries in Romania and say, we need this amount of fabric, we need these kind of objects and all of that. And to save money, so these uniforms, for example, would be made on site, and using the knowledge and the kind of the labor of the people who were working there, who are not necessarily seamstress. So some of the mothers who accompanied the children were strongly encouraged to participate in in this work, and besides taking care of the children, participate in kind of taking care of the whole buildings themselves, cooking food for the children, and doing this these kind of uniforms. And it was part of kind of making the children and then the adults kind of productive members of society. But when some of the women refused, this was seen very negatively, because especially since they were women and they were seen as having a stronger impact on the children, the fact that they didn't want to engage in this type of labor was heavily criticized. And this was kind of a reality at the general level of society. Now, in terms of weekly menu, so we have also growing interest in kind of scientific calculations of what is the amount of calories and type of food that children should receive. Now, this is kind of an ideal. It didn't always work out like this, but there were checkups. For example, if the products change normally, the doctor should know. So, and when this was changed and the doctor was not informed prior to that, there were reports explaining what was going on. And there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that this was unplanned. There was a lot of kind of difficulty gaining access to these. In terms of food, just some images of the food that children didn't like. And I've learned from my mom that rice with plums is something that's eaten during the, I forgot how it's called, when you don't eat meat and dairy before Easter. I've never had that. I've just had them separately. But the mix of salt and sweet was something that the children were not used to. And there was a lot of pressure on the mothers that accompanied the children to cook the food themselves. And they said, no, we are here to actually take care of these children, not to cook. This is your job, you are paid for this. But the directors of these centers were insisted on this, and this was seen also as a way of saving money. Now, again, norms for children, and each kind of depending on age and supplies, in a very centralized way. And as I was saying, I looked at French institutions, and we see the same thing. The child at this age needs this kind of objects and stuff. And this just some images to see whom we're talking about. Here in the middle, you see some of the uniforms that I showed you. Also, their involvement in learning I forgot, a trade, and most of them were learned working class trades. So very few actually went to university. There were possibilities of going to university, but kind of the number was very, very small. I really like this image of the little boy with the tree. Actually, on the back side, on the other side, it said, Greece will need architects. So drawing is a good thing. And this is actually an image from the 50s. So it's after, the war had been lost. So this projection for the future and the role of these children in building the future of Greece was maintained. Now, while there's a realization that these children will stay here for longer, some start to go into paid employment, and that's where we lose them. It's really difficult to kind of continue to see what happens to them. But those that entered into the general school system, they were still under the supervision of the Red Cross. So there was a lot of kind of regular meetings. They received packages. They could ask. It was again the same thing. Girls needed 3 dresses. Boys needed that. They needed this kind of objects, this kind of food, canned or different things. And there were special seats, not seats, but there was a number of 4 Greek and Macedonian children, there were, I don't know, 15 in one institution, 18 in another institution. Their dissemination was decided mainly depending on central interests and what was believed to be necessary at the level of the economy, but they could have some limited margins for maneuver and negotiate. So especially this, they could negotiate when they had really good contact with someone from the Red Cross. And some had this connection with people and they call, this is like my mother or my father. And this person would intervene for them and would switch them to another school because this is where their friends went, or they were more interested in this. But broadly speaking, the decisions were taken depending on the needs of the economy and what was believed that they needed to learn as trade for then the economy in Romania and maybe later on Greece, but that was no longer discussed. This is just kind of an image. It's not the Greek children, just Romanians going to high school during this period, but I thought it would be nice to see the other uniforms people used to wear during this period. Now, I will try to be very brief with this. Why does this matter? So for Romania, there were both national and international benefits to be involved in this. So if we talk about the international interests, so Romania was involved in this as other countries in Central Europe, and this movement was kind of coordinated by the Soviet Union. This was seen as part of the fight against fascism. Fight against fascism or the Nazis that was won by the Soviet Union during the Second World War, but that continued. And this was associated with anti-imperialism and anti-fascism. And this was a reality in most of the countries that took in children. This was also a way of kind of projecting internationally a positive image of these new countries and these new regimes, both by in kind of going beyond actual fighting and war and using soft power, using cooperation. And it was also a way to force these countries to cooperate with each other. And it was not always easy to cooperate with East Germany, for example, but there needed to be arrangements and discussions on what would happen to the children, how do we distribute them, how do we decide, or information about in East Germany, the children did this, or they were received. So there was a forced cooperation on that side, and sometimes the official discourse didn't fit with the population's feelings or reactions, but yeah, that's kind of the main point. And also for smaller countries, being involved in this activity, but also more broadly being involved in transnational kind of solidarity actions and cooperation was also a way of escaping political isolation. So we live in, this is a period of the Cold War. We have the two superpowers, but all countries that exist kind of in the two camps in Europe, they all wanted to find kind of their position, there are certain margins for maneuver, not just be in the shadow and follow what their respective superpower wanted. And one of these methods was this. And there was also, when I'm talking about cooperation, this also led to kind of confrontation or between the countries. For example, which country was able to send the best doctors in this country. So there was a conflict between ways of seeing modernity, but also between East and West, but also between countries in the East. Which one of them was more successful? Which one of them received more students? Which one of them was able to provide more aid and support, in a way demonstrating that they were better than the other. At the national level, and this is something that I've been looking at, we see the first steps in the path towards building the institutionalized childcare system. And I see this kind of the going from one group of children to the other kind of as the learning curve, or the learning process. And I was talking about something old, something new. For example, this daily schedule I was mentioning, I thought initially it was a Soviet model, but in reality, when we read a lot of the practices like outdoor activities, the structured way of life was very typical of the interwar period. And we see this introduced in Romania, for example, after the unification in 1918. And this is a process that is used a lot, for example, like outdoor activities in nature with children to kind of build national identity. And these are models that are brought from Germany, German thinkers. So these ideas are brought to Romania and applied to Romania as a way of kind of bonding people and creating a sense of national identity and community through activities outdoors. This is something new, the scientific look at calories and how much of each children needed to have. So older elements mixed with newer elements. And also, so just very briefly, so as I was mentioning, there were no textbooks, but there were also not enough people trained to take care of the children. With the nationalization of different institutions, also education was nationalized, and a lot of the childcare that was being done before was mainly charity-based by religious institutions. And these individuals could only continue to do their work as educators if they renounced their religious vows and clothing. So some refused to do so, and there was a lack of actual people. And one of the centers for children was actually used as a center to educate, to form educators that then were spread across the country. But they also needed people to kind of teach these educators. They would learn by doing, but they also needed people who had some experience. And for example, in Tulgesh, there were 3 people who knew what they were doing, and everybody else was learning. And one of them had over 20 years experience, and this was the person that actually was sharing all the knowledge with everyone else. So in reality, it was all this kind of continuity of knowledge between the interwar period with the Cold War period, with the Cold War period. And I'm emphasizing this because often when we talk about regimes, we tend to separate them and say, everything is new, everything was changed. But in reality, there's a lot of continuity. There's new elements, but there's also older elements that are brought in. So there's this combination of both individuals, but also forms of action. Okay, outdoor activities are already kind of mentioned here. These are Korean children, Greek children, and just some images of outdoor activities. And what else? Yes, so just briefly, I'll just finish with so I mentioned when the Greek children arrived, everything was chaotic. They were not ready, the institutions were not ready. When the North Korean children arrived, everything was a lot better organized. They were transported by train. They were a lot better kind of the physical medical conditions. And also the institutions where they were brought had already housed children. So the way to kind of receive them and the different type of activities were already kind of learned through kind of practice with the other groups. So this kind of continues. This is a learning curve by doing with these children. Also, this was also used, and there's a lot more images for the Korean children than for the Greek children, especially for the beginning of their arrival, because then, so the first few years, they were used a lot for propaganda. But afterwards, the adults who accompanied the children weren't very happy with this use, so they kind of prohibited the use of images of these children. It was a way to illustrate both, on one hand, the role of Romania as a country that helps children and provides aid to children, and present this image of valiant children who are fighting against imperialism and against fascists, and more broadly to present Romania as East Central Europe as a region where children were important. So these images of children who are happy in Romania, let me see if I have other images. Yes, so we have smiling children, happy, healthy on the left. And on the right, we have horrible images of children in the evil empire who were not only victims of war, some were victims of conflict. There were also images of children who lived in capitalist societies who, because of the capitalist system, were not cared for. So they lived on the streets, didn't have enough food. So there's this kind of dichotomy between a good system and a bad system. So this allows for building kind of this national image, and the population becomes more involved and wants to support this action. And there's really very interesting stories that these children tell. So it's very gendered too. So for example, the boys are all often presented as little warriors who risk their lives to fight against the kind of taking arms or giving information. And the girls are presented as sacrificial, wanting to give their blood or taking care of wounded soldiers before. But these are all presented as worthy children, children worthy of being protected because they had fought against the enemy. And then the images that we see of them are all very happy and smiling all the time in comparison with the other ones. Yes, vocational training. This is something that actually I want to look at, so I just put it here because I'm interested in this. This is something that really kind of was developing a lot during this period, and also a lot of the scholarships that were given to students from abroad were for vocational training. And this was something that I discovered in the archives, so it's always great to go to the archives. I just want to kind of go more into kind of look at this more and the importance of vocational training. But in general, there was a lot of emphasis put on volunteer work in the population, and like the Stakhanovist worker who overdid it, and in their free time the workers worked and did objects for the children, or did extra objects that were then sold, and then the money was given to the children. So this emphasis. And yes, just to finish, as I promised, very briefly, the arrival of the children from Greece comes at a time where Romania is trying to build its the new state and build itself and in its image, both nationally and internationally. And in terms of child protection, we have the first step of child institutionalization, and these buildings are then later used for other groups of children. And there's not the ones that I've showed, because those are then given to tourism, but other structures are then later on used by Romanian children, or so Romanian institutionalized children use those institutions afterwards. So there's this continuity of the usage of these structures, and then this continuity of ideas between the pre-war period and the post-war period is also something that I'm interested in, and to see what is new and what is old in this new system that is being built, and how not only in this but at the workshop I showed you initially, this is something that actually came up in a variety of case studies, how this is kind of a learning process. An activity is done a bit chaotically in the beginning, and then you learn from this, and the next one you do it better, and you do it better. And this is kind of how the system worked and how this aid helped in this process. And I'm stopping here. Thank you. And looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scutaru. Now, may I just ask for anyone that has questions, very briefly, if you could just maybe raise your hands, we will assign you a microphone. Anybody? Please, over there. Gentlemen, we will just hand you the microphone now in a second. Just. Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I hope you can hear me. Thanks so much for your presentation. I kind of have two questions, I guess.
Yep.
My first question, I know you mentioned the Red Cross and educators. I'm wondering a bit more about the staff of the institutions and who they were, and why they worked there, and how that worked.
Yes.
And then my other question is actually in relation to what you mentioned about the continued use of space. I wondered about kind of geographies of the space, and a little bit more about how the spaces were constructed and what that also says about kind of the usage and the planning. Thank you.
Thank you. To answer the second question first, the issue is that one good thing is that some of the institutions were abandoned and now they're being rediscovered, and there's this fantastic online museum where one of the institutions was digitized, so you can visit. I forgot the Museum of Abandonment. So you can actually go inside the building and institution. So there was 3D, there's a 3D plan of it. But there's not a lot of information about that. What we do know is that initially, so these structures that I talked about, they were not planned for so many children. So they were rebuilt. For example, walls were torn down to make the rooms bigger. Beds were built to have all the children together. Fireplaces were built. Infirmaries were built to kind of in special buildings next to this, but especially when illustrating this kind of focus on contagious disease. But this is something that really I want to look at more. But yeah, there is a change of the space in these institutions, and actually I have to go on site and then find these. Some of these institutions have been kind of repurposed, but some still exist and they're just closed off. So that's really something that this group, the Museum of Abandonment, is doing now, trying to identify these institutions and then to see kind of making the plan of the institution and see how the space was used. In relation to the staff, so the everyday stuff, cleaning and the cooks were local. And the rest of the staff, like teachers, doctors, they were sent by and decided by the ministry. So the Ministry of Health decided that there would be X number of doctors, nurses that would be sent to each institution, and then they would need to ask, we need more doctors. For example, they were general doctors, but they're not dentists, or so. And each time they needed medication or there was a need for equipment, there was the demand was done through the Red Cross to the different ministries to ask for equipment or to ask for different types of medication. And often, well, as you see, these structures were kind of outside the city, and there was very little contact with kind of the local population, except with the staff. And sometimes the staff would bring their children with them. So then that would be, and very controlled contact with the villages. Sometimes they would participate in a festivity, or they would help with, I don't know, collecting some, fruit or something. So they would actually, but as a group, not individual. So their interactions were very controlled. Thank you.
I think there was another question just over there, please.
Beatrice, I have a quick question while the microphone is going over to that gentleman. It's about the financing. This must have been expensive. And what proportion of the economy, the budget, you mentioned fundraising as well. I'm surprised that people on such a small disposable income would be able to fundraise for children like this.
Yeah. It is a big investment. And I was also surprised by that, especially since these were not the only ones. So the countries took in not only children, but they also took in soldiers, wounded soldiers. Sometimes they would take them in to kind of take care of them. They would go back to fight. Some would be just not unable to go back and fight. And then when the war was over, some elderly women, disabled, former soldiers would stay in Romania. Some would not be able. So the idea was to have them work as much as possible, but some were unable. So they all received a pension. And I don't know exactly the percentage in terms of national budget, but it was quite a consistent, a big amount. And it did come, so there was some help from there was at the European level, there was this committee for the help and protection of Greek children, but mainly a lot of the money came nationally. This is why sometimes they were lacking access to certain goods, yes, but they were using the cause of the children is always a very successful one, to mobilize people to provide support and aid. So there was this combination of these innocent children that needed to be protected and taken care of, either through money, but also through volunteer work, or people giving objects to the children, or they would go to performance. Children would perform traditional songs and dances, and people would pay a ticket to go and see that. So there were different ways, even small amounts of money people would pay for this. And at the same time, while this vulnerability of the children was put forward, it was also presented as, the fighting against the enemy and the just cause of that. And not in Romania, but in other countries, for example, Czechoslovakia, there was a lot of emphasis by kind of former soldiers who talked about, you only understand this when you've been through this, and we need to mobilize. So they were kind of using that discourse and mobilizing also.
Sir.
Yeah, hello. Is that way? Yeah, and without in any way wishing to detract from what was done for these children, I noticed in your map of where the children were allocated,
yes,
that, for instance, they weren't allocated to regions where there would have been an existing Greek community. This is Constanța, Dobruja.
Yes.
And obviously there may have been reasons for that at government level. Certainly, I think that the Greek community had, there were many who were being persecuted for their bourgeois origins at that time. But I just wonder, has there been any research done on what actually happened to these children? I think you said at the beginning that they mostly stayed in Romania. Were they absorbed in, become Romanianized, or did they maintain their Greek identity? Thank you.
So yeah, the lack of contact with the existing communities was also something that I was not necessarily expecting. So when they first arrived, the staff didn't speak Greek. So it was really difficult to communicate. So that created, kind of complicated situations. So I was surprised, why didn't they bring people who spoke Greek to help out? Then I was reading some archives at some documents in another archive, and there was kind of a conflict with between a part of the Greek community who were given the possibility of leaving Romania in the first years through the, if I'm not mistaken, the Swiss embassy. They would apply for a visa and then would be able to leave the country. So there was a lack of trust in the Greek community that already lives in Romania and their political leanings, because the idea was, we make these children healthy and then we educate them as communist citizens, with the ideas that were believed to be the correct idea. So I think the contact with existing communities was seen as risky. Also, there was a very strong, and at the same time, there was a very strong emphasis on maintaining national identity through language. So they continued throughout the whole period to study in Greek, in Macedonian, to study the Greek history, geography, and that. So it wasn't erased completely. Now, it's very easy to have information on the children who continued studying because there's all these reports. But those that went into work, started working in different factories, that's more difficult to have information on them. I've had this plan for a while, but I haven't been able to actually go and identify some cities and actually go and try and find people to interview. And some stayed in Romania. Some moved to other countries. So in the 50s and the 60s, there were different attempts to reunite families, which was very complicated because some children didn't remember their names. Some children remembered it differently, or it was spelled differently. So they had family members, parents or brothers and sisters in other countries, but they didn't remember how they were called. So their names, so it was really difficult to say, okay, this is definitely this person's child. But this did happen. And some decided to return they were able to return. So just to organize. In the beginning of the 50s, the Greek government said, we want the children back. And communist states said no. But then they said, oh, this costs a lot of money. Maybe we can send some of them back. Then the Greek government said, maybe it's risky to have all these children who have been educated under socialist regime back to Greece. So we don't want them back anymore. So then many lost their citizenship and were unable to return until the end of the 70s, when there was a change of regime and a change of law, and they were able to apply for passport and to go back to Greece. In the meantime, many of them had kind of started working, built families in the countries where they were living, and didn't necessarily want to move their whole family abroad. But some did return. Many actually returned after retirement to Greece. And some there's a book from which I took the map. Let me see if I can. I will give you a headache now, just so you be prepared. Yes, so this book looks at children in both institutions run in Eastern Europe, but also institutions by Queen Frederica. And the authors did a lot of interviews with children, and which talk about kind of their movement across borders. And one story is really interesting, of a child who went to East Germany and had a quite comfortable situation there, and decided to go back to Greece, and then lost all the benefits they had in East Germany. And when they wanted to go back, they were not allowed because they'd lost their citizenship. Now, for their citizenship in Romania, so it was officially they all became citizens in the 50s, but in reality, I didn't find any documents of them being citizens. So they had, in the East, the refugee status was not individual, was given to a group. So they all had the special kind of ID card, and some could apply to become citizens. But I've just found some of these ID cards, and I'm still struggling to find more of them and see exactly what kind of status they had. But with time, they became, yes, Romanian citizens. But initially, it was stated that all of them became Romanian citizens, and in reality, it's more complicated than that.
Thank you. We're a bit over time, so I think we will close our Q&A for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you again, Dr. Scutaru, for giving us this lecture. And just to note, this time next week, the same place, we have a lecture on, surprise, surprise, Transnistria. So please, everybody, come in. We'll be waiting for you here. Okay, thank you very much.